in simultaneous broadcast from a hidden cornfield in Wisconsin and some time-forgotten Holy of Holies in the Theban mountains of Luxor, Egypt. Intrepid Radio with Scotty Roberts and Dr. John Ward.
Well, welcome back, everybody, and here we are, back on Intrepid Radio with Ciaran O'Keeffe and Scotty Roberts and my good self. For some reason, Scotty wants me to bring you all back in, so I'll do my best here. During the break, actually, we were discussing with Ciaran, while Scotty had gone off for one of his little breaks, the present... Sorry, Scotty. The research that many of you are aware that I carried out and have been carrying out for many years now. And those of you that attended the Paradigm Symposium will be more than aware of this research. And that pertains to the late 19th century, early 20th century Egyptological community here in Egypt, and their ties and relationships with the members, or active members, I should say, of the Society for Psychical Research, which Ciaran mentioned earlier, very briefly, the SPR. And Ciaran, we were discussing there just in the break, briefly, how some of these members of the Egyptological community, like Pitt Rivers and Petrie and so forth, and Sir John Lubbock, were members of the SPR. And how does that, for me, when I look at those members and I look at their research that they were carrying out here in Egypt, and, you know, Pitt Rivers was here with Petrie and Sir John Lubbock merely collecting flint tools from the Theban mountain. When you look back through the records and so forth, as you just rightly said about the skeptics, have you read the documentation and so forth, do you get a feel of nostalgia when you read through the old reports?
Oh, yes, definitely. And it's quite interesting you mentioned some of the names there. And we mentioned about synchronicity earlier on in this interview. On Saturday, I was at the Pitt Rivers Museum.
Wonderful.
So you mentioned that.
That's a place I would like to visit.
The synchronicity of all this now is actually quite absurd, because as Scotty knows, we were invited and entertained by a wonderful Dutch group that have been here. They've all gone back to Holland now, but they were here this week, or the latter part of last week and the early part of this week. And they were actually, traipsing the Theban mountains looking for clues to a lost tomb, which one of the directors of this Dutch group had written a book on. And they contacted us because of the Theban Hills research that both Maria and myself had been carrying out many years ago, which led to the SPR, and that led me down that route on my side of the research with the white painted symbols that many of the audience may be au fait with, which we found and located in the Theban mountains.
I remember that was about a year ago summer, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. And it was part and parcel of the presentation we gave at the Hypatia conference in Greece, because the symbolism had taken on an esoteric, and this pertains now exactly to the question that Scotty asked of you, Ciaran, prior to the break, and the way in which academia sometimes frowns upon. It's kind of weird because, as you probably know, and Scotty and I are taking a group out on the Exodus Reality Adventure in February with Chris Conway. And when we decided to invite Chris, we had to put together a new brand of advertising and some new graphics, and Scotty did his amazing usual job and came up with some wonderful imagery. But within the wording, he'd used, quite rightly, because we all pertain to it, the word esoteric. And Maria saw the advert in the morning and went, "Oh, no, you can't use the word esoteric. No. And I said, calm down. This is what it's all about." But... and Scotty's laughing because he knows exactly what, bless her, Maria is like.
Love Maria.
Ciaran, do you find that you have to sometimes, for want of a better word, retreat behind the ramparts of academia to protect yourself from external influences that may damage your reputation, academically speaking?
Yeah, it's a very good point. There's an element of caution sometimes in what I do in terms of the parapsychology research, certainly in terms of funding applications. Parapsychologists are severely limited anyway in terms of funding for any sort of academic research. There are probably only 3 or 4 organizations worldwide that would even consider funding parapsychology projects. So if we're seeking funding outside of those organizations, there has to be a very cautious approach to how we word those particular applications. And you said about the use of the word, esoteric. It's quite funny that in the UK, and I guess to North America to some extent, you will hear, instead of parapsychology, I mentioned at the beginning of the show, exceptional human experiences is a reframing of the sorts of experiences that people might have, but in such a way that it distances itself slightly from being paranormal. And so I'm being cautious in that respect. But also you touch on another point, which is one of, again, my many hats, is that I'd have a reputation because of the very public work that I do in the paranormal, the TV work. And I'm quite lucky, really, in any of the universities that I've been in, Liverpool, even across in Toulouse or Hertfordshire, and now Buxton University, that colleagues recognise that I have a hat that I wear, which is a very public, media-led portrayal of the paranormal, or kind of being involved in that. But I also, my peer-reviewed publications, my conference presentations, my teaching, my research, is recognised for that, and that speaks for itself amongst my colleagues and amongst the kind of scientific community. So I'm quite lucky that I don't have to hide too much, but maybe I have to work a little bit harder to gain that respectability because of things like Most Haunted and various other shows in which people immediately associate myself with that.
It was amazing, Ciaran, to hear you say all that, because as many of the audience will know, and as Scotty is aware, you, word for word, basically, you've repeated exactly what I've always had to say, and that is wearing of many hats and being acknowledging the fact that you are always under scrutiny within academia and within public as well. And as you quite rightly say, it's how you are perceived in both camps, and you have to wear these different hats for that perception. But as Scotty well knows, after Paradigm this year, we were both, I was asked to answer some questions on ancient aliens on the television program. And unfortunately I had to decline because of the connotations attached to it. And that is such an instance where, again, the perception or the ramifications of appearing on such a show, what that would have damage-wise upon my academic career and that of our research and our funding. And that's the most important thing. And as you quite rightly say yourself, the funding side of things is the most important. And that's where we have the problems.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And like I said, I wouldn't necessarily say it's a battle. I think I've just been quite lucky in the respect of people have this perception of me because of very public shows like Most Haunted, and it's a perception of me being cynical rather than truly skeptical, but also often academics who do not know me, their only perception of me is based on watching me on Most Haunted until they meet me at a conference, and of course my conference presentations do speak for themselves, whether it's forensics or parapsychology. But then also quite surprised to learn that I have published in various areas of applied psychology. It's always this wearing different hats and speaking to different audiences.
You picked up. Sorry, Scott. I just want to quickly cover this one, and that is the wording. And I want to have your take on this, Ciaran. The words such as esoteric, hermetic, alchemy. Why do you think there is such an adverse reaction within academia to these words? Do you think it has is there a, dare I say this, do you think there is a religious aversion to it?
I think the problem is ignorance. And I don't use the word ignorance negatively because it sounds very, very negative. It's more ignorance in terms of not knowing. Maybe that's a better way of putting it, a more positive slant on it, is that there's a perception of words like you say, esoteric, hermetic, alchemy as well. It's almost lumping all of those terms together, and then what is the perception that somebody in academia has, or somebody even not in academia has, of those particular words is kind of moulded by their experience with any one of those words. And so alchemy is probably the most well known. If people start to associate alchemy with the esoteric or hermetic philosophy, theosophy, you name it, but if they hear the word alchemy, they might immediately be thinking of some ancient magician or chemist trying to change some object into gold or something like that. Right. Some kind of general perception that they may have heard about in a documentary or read fleetingly in a magazine. The same way that when I was in France, it was the same sort of issue, but not with those particular words. In France, the kind of upper echelons of politics and people that make decisions about education, there was an immediate negative response to any form of parapsychology research. And I thought it was the same reasons that there were in the UK and America, in terms of people not feeling as though, it's a genuine science. But actually, it was completely the reverse, and it might mirror what's happening with the words you say. And that is, these people making these educational decisions had lived through the Second World War. And in France, there was this perception during the Second World War that Hitler and the Nazis, rightly or wrongly, were doing research into the black arts and the occult generally. And it was a very, very dark search that they were doing, a very dark exploration and dark research. And that the perception of parapsychology into the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and even in the last decade, by people making these decisions in education, because they didn't know what parapsychology was, they immediately associated it with the word occult. And then because their perception of the occult was the research that had supposedly been done by Hitler in the Second World War, there was an immediate dismissal of anything to do with parapsychology. And it was merely associating the word with something that they thought was similar, and therefore the person that did that research all those years ago, who of course is one of the most negative human beings anyway, it all is associated part and parcel of the same thing, so let's reject it. And so I wonder if the same thing is happening with these other words, not in perhaps as extreme way, but that people have a perception of one of the words, either misperceived or a very general perception, and they immediately associate the same meaning with all of the other words.
Boy, we haven't run into any of that, have we, John?
I was being very quiet there.
You were going to hold your tongue, weren't you?
I am holding my tongue. I'm not saying a word.
I just want you to know, Ciaran, that by talking to Dr. John Ward, you're talking with a Nazi occultist. I just want you to know that.
I have been brandished or tarred with that feather. Yes. Let's move on, shall we?
Let's move on. And Ciaran, just so you know, John is not a Nazi.
Yes. But I like it that you didn't say I was an occultist. I like that part.
Or as they say down south, you're a Nazi. You're a Nazi.
You're a Nazi.
So
I'm going to give myself some Nazi scalps.
Well, let's move on to something that's I think congruent with this conversation. John's happy to move on from that right now. I will bust his nut wide open. You'll see steam coming out and his eyes falling out of his sockets if I've got to get him into a conversation about that stuff. So I don't know, Ciaran, what you've experienced in those realms, if anything, because of the kind of position you hold with all of this. But when you're in the public eye, and maybe you can comment on this, when you are in the public eye, like you are, like John is, like I am to a certain extent, you sometimes get criticisms leveled at you where you drop your jaw and say, what in the world is this person talking about?
Yeah.
Do you get that in your field? Now, you say you're very lucky, of course, because of the way you're looked at. But do you also get the criticism? Have you had criticism leveled at you, say, for things that even you have come out and criticized a bit, like being on Most Haunted? You were the voice of reason there. Loved watching you on that show. But talk about that experience a little bit and how it fits into this.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Just to backtrack a little to the beginning of your question about it's almost being damned by association, is that just being associated with even mediumship research, people immediately tar me with the same brush as mediums that are exposed to be frauds, for example. So there is that association. There is quite a negative perspective from some sections of the population, but generally I think I am quite lucky in terms of having quite a positive response to what I do in the public domain and academic domain.
Oh, that's good.
In terms of my experience with Most Haunted, which I was involved with for 6 years, I think, 6-7 years, I'm extremely grateful for the experience that I had involved in Most Haunted, and for Carl and Yvette giving me the chance to be involved in that show. Also, because I had a public face of the way I think, in terms of, like you say, having reason, giving kind of the alternative, skeptical explanation to what's going on. So I was very much somebody that was reflecting what I generally do in parapsychology, although sometimes I came across maybe as too cynical in terms of what's happening. But there was always the danger, being part of a show like that I would be tarnished with the same brush that people would have, who would look very negatively at the show because of the screaming, because of the constant repeatable phenomena that seems to happen on demand on a regular basis.
I was amazed by how they could get such immediate response and so quickly and so regularly.
Yes. Yeah, and I mean that's just one very small part of it, and that's one very small part of any sort of ghost investigation, is when you're confronted with phenomena like a tapping sound, which is allegedly a spirit sound. The immediate reaction to that from any investigator, who thinks quite critically, is, okay, let's have a look around and look for a possible source for that tapping. And
usually prefaced by, "Did you hear that?"
Yeah. Yeah, and there was I remember a classic episode where there was a group of people standing in a room, one group in one corner and one group in the other, and the one group in one corner heard some sort of tapping noise, and they went, "Oh my God, did you hear that?" And they shouted over to the group on the other side of the room and said, "Did you hear that?" And they said, "No, but it sounded like it was coming from over there."
Nice.
It kind of encapsulates it as well. But at the end of the day, you're dealing with a television show, albeit a televised investigation, of a haunted location, but also a televised investigation run by Carl and Yvette. It's what they wanted to do in terms of an investigation, and it's one particular approach. And who am I to say what is the best approach? My only role there was to comment on the alternative explanations, and things like tapping and objects throwing and people having various experiences and noises, that sort of thing. It's actually quite easy to come up with natural explanations in those sort of situations.
Absolutely. And now your overall feel, not to open up any can of worms or anything, but your overall feel of how that particular show, out of all the shows that are out there, I enjoyed it, the way they approached the show, the graphics on the show that they would use to describe locations. I enjoyed your part in it immensely, because to me, as I've said twice now in this conversation, it was the voice of reason there as opposed to more sensational. What was your overall take there? Did you enjoy your stint with them? Did you find, I know there was all the talk about fraud and fakery with Derek and things like that, but what's your overall take with the show there, and how did your relationship end up with that show?
Well, there's two different parts to it. Your first part was, did I enjoy my time on the show? Absolutely loved it. had a fantastic time. Like I said, I'm very grateful for the opportunity. We saw some amazing locations, and of course some of those locations out in North America too, and I never would have had, I don't think I ever would have had that opportunity just as a lowly academic to visit some of these locations and have access. So I think it was brilliant, and at times there was a great team. You know, we got on famously. In terms of where it fits, in terms of my whole outlook in parapsychology, you know, there is a point at which I step back from it and say it was a television show. It doesn't fit into any of the parapsychology research I conduct. When it finished filming kind of around spring 2010, I left, a number of other people left. It had basically just finished. They finished filming. There was talk about there being a Halloween show later on that year, but I think they kind of stopped filming at that point. And it was a natural finish. It felt like a very natural finish. I, at the time, was looking to get back into academia, where I'd been in France, so it felt only natural for me to try and get it back into UK academia, and successfully did. And I'm very happy that I'm back in academia, and I look back at that time, Most Haunted, very, very fondly. But people often ask me about, you know, the evidence that was captured on the show, and I say, well, look, if I'm in control of an investigation, it would be very, very different. And actually, to be honest, you know, if I was in control of an investigation and you saw the entire investigation, a lot of it would be like watching paint dry, and it would not be entertaining.
Ain't that the truth? You know, when I would lead some investigations, I would sit in a dark room with people, and we always, you always do it in the dark. But sitting in the dark with equipment, and an hour in and you got no response, no nothing, people became bored with it. I said, now remember, what you see on TV is edited. There's production value there. They're not going to show you 5 hours of people sitting in the dark, televised. To be continued next week, hour 2 of our sit in a silent house. It just didn't happen. And so, yeah, the investigation is certainly different than you see it televised. And in the as so many times is said in so many different ways, the soundbite cyber moment world that we live in now, people don't have the patience to do what you do.
No, absolutely not. And you're right. You know, any of these shows, whether it's Most Haunted or any others, you know, are shows that have hundreds of hours of footage that has to be reduced down to, ends up being about 48 minutes for an hour show. And so all of that has to be reduced to 48 minutes. And yeah, what are you going to watch? Are you going to watch two people sitting in a room for 48 minutes where nothing happens? Or is there going to be an element of presenting the best bits and presenting it in an entertaining way to keep the fans watching? And, you try any of that. That's what happens, and that's the nature of television.
I will say, and this is the last thing I want to say about televised ghost hunting and Most Haunted, one of the most frustrating things I had about that show was saying, these people have been doing this for how many years, and they're still screaming when they hear a noise. I thought, you have not steeled yourself at all, have you? And how much of that was done for entertainment value versus, I'm really going to scream after having 10 or 12 years under my belt of looking for ghosts.
It is quite funny, but to be fair, for Yvette, I took Yvette on some private investigations just so that she could get to see what the private investigations were. And in the main, some of them were dull as dishwater. There was nothing that happened in them. But there were a couple of others where there were moments of interest. But in terms of investigating a place in the dark, with Yvette, where there weren't any cameras, she's a scaredy cat. And no amount of investigations is going to change that at all. Now, as soon as the camera's switched on, there may be an element of more dramatics, for anybody that's in front of the camera. But to be honest, she can be a scaredy cat when it comes to walking around in the dark.
Well, John and I are both nervous as hell to talk on radio, but we put on our radio face.
Speak for yourself, sir. Speak for yourself.
You can take the boys out of the city, but you can never plug a dam in Denmark with your thumb. Intrepid Radio, with a haphazardly focused Scotty Roberts and the rollicking, adventurous Dr. John Ward.
Sticking their fingers in the hole in the dike of humanity.